The mansion was quiet with that silence that isn't peace. It was the silence of houses too big for the people who live in them, where sounds get lost in the hallways before reaching anyone, where a child can cry for a solid half hour without anyone downstairs needing to decide what to do about it. The kind of silence that costs a lot and isn't worth the price. Sarah was kneeling on the Persian rug in Sophia's bedroom. The rug was red with gold details, the kind of piece chosen by someone who understood interior design, and not children. Because 4-year-olds don't need Persian rugs, they need soft floors where they can fall without getting hurt. Sophia was in the center of that rug, her little face red and her eyes so full of tears that they spilled out the sides when she shook her head, her little arms stretched forward with that universal body language that needs no words in any language in the world. She wanted to be held. Sarah hadn't reached her in time to pick her up before the door opened. The door flew open with the force of someone who doesn't knock, because knocking implies waiting for an answer, and he wasn't in the mood to wait for anything. Richard walked in wearing a black suit that cost more than Sarah made in 3 months, and the expression of someone who had seen something on the security cameras and had concocted, in the walk between the downstairs office and the upstairs bedroom, a complete story about what had happened. His finger pointed at the dark glass domes on the ceiling with the conviction of someone presenting evidence. "I saw everything on the cameras. What did you do to my daughter?" Sarah didn't answer. She stayed kneeling for another second, looking at him with the expression of someone who has heard accusations before having time to defend herself and has learned over time that sometimes the most efficient answer isn't words. She stood up slowly. She wiped her own tears with the back of her hand because she had been crying too. Not out of fear, but out of that emotion that comes when a child cries with that intensity, and you feel every note of their cry as if it were your own. And she began to sing. It was very quiet, almost as if it were to herself or to the room or to the air, a melody that came from a place older than that mansion, older than that neighborhood, older perhaps than anything on that floor of marble and imported rugs. A language that wasn't English, that had other consonants, other vowels that came from another place in the throat, with that specific softness of certain African languages that seem made for lullabies. Sophia stopped crying, not gradually, not with that process of slowly diminishing hiccups. She stopped. Her eyes widened like someone who heard something they recognize without yet knowing where they recognize it from. And then she broke into a smile that completely transformed the little face that had been so red and so broken a second earlier. She walked over to Sarah and hugged her leg with both arms, and Richard stood frozen in the doorway. There was something happening on his face that wasn't anger. The anger had flowed out like water when you turn on a faucet and suddenly turn it off, suspended in the air for a second before falling. What was left in its place was something else, something he clearly hadn't anticipated feeling in that moment, that had caught him off guard in a way anger never does because anger prepares itself. But certain memories arrive without warning. The song. He knew that song. Not the way you know a song you heard once, but the way you know the smell of home when you walk in after a long time away, with that body memory that bypasses thought. His mother had sung that melody, those exact syllables, that exact intonation, from that exact place in the throat where the sound came from. His mother had died 20 years ago. He gripped the doorframe with a force that wasn't necessary to keep himself standing, but that was necessary for something else happening inside him. What? His voice came out different than how it had entered the room, smaller, without the volume he had brought in. How do you know that song? But to understand who Sarah is, and why that song tasted the way it did coming from her throat, we need to leave that mansion and cross the entire city to an apartment in a neighborhood where the buses arrive after 6 in the morning, because before 6 the route doesn't pay off yet. Sarah woke up at 5. The apartment was small, with that honesty that small apartments have when the people living in them have decided to truly inhabit them, instead of just sleeping in them. The walls had color, not the neutral color of a renter who doesn't want to commit, but the color of someone who chose it and painted it with their own hands. There were objects placed with care, not catalog decor, but objects that came from somewhere and carried that weight. A dark wooden statuette on a shelf, a piece of patterned fabric draped over the back of a chair, candles around a photograph on a small table in the corner of the bedroom. The photograph was of an elderly woman, with a smile that took up her whole face. Sarah passed by the photo every morning before leaving, not with the ostentatious gesture of someone ritualizing pain, but with that brief attention of someone checking if the person is still there, as if the photo were a window and not a frame. The necklace went on her neck before anything else. She put it on while still in her pajamas, before coffee, before brushing her teeth. The beads were colored with an arrangement that wasn't random, that followed a logic she knew, and that had been placed there by hands that were no longer hers, but whose work remained. She had received the necklace from her grandmother. She could still see the scene with that clarity that certain memories have, the clarity that isn't of a photograph, but of a sensation. The temperature of her grandmother's hands, the smell of the backyard where they were, the afternoon light coming in from a specific angle. Her grandmother had put the necklace on her with the solemnity of someone transferring something that isn't just an object, had adjusted the beads on Sarah's chest with both thumbs, had looked at her in a way Sarah would only understand years later. And she had sung the same song, that exact melody that came from Sarah's throat that morning in Sophia's bedroom, with the naturalness of someone who sings what they learned before learning anything else. Sarah took 2 buses to get to the mansion. On the first one, which she caught at the corner of her house at 6:20, she sat by the window with her purse on her lap and the necklace between her fingers, sliding the beads one by one with a movement that wasn't a formal prayer but was something close to it, the way certain people have of organizing their thoughts before a day that will require patience. On the second bus, which she caught at the transit center after a wait that varied between 10 minutes and an eternity, depending on the city's mood that day, she sometimes slept for 5 minutes with her forehead against the window, and when she woke up, there was always a second of disorientation before remembering where she was going and why. She had gotten that job through a recommendation from a woman she had worked for 2 years prior, who had called Giselle describing Sarah as the most careful person she had ever seen with children, a word Giselle had jotted down with the efficiency of someone noting resume requirements, but hadn't exactly relayed to Richard the way it was said. Richard didn't know much about Sarah beyond what was on the file Giselle had prepared. Name, age, references, address. The kind of information gathered about someone who is going to take care of your child, without implying you actually know that person. The mansion appeared after a tree-lined street where the houses got bigger and the walls higher the further you went, as if wealth grew along with the distance from ordinary sidewalks. The electronic gate opened when Giselle pushed the button, which was when Giselle was in the mood to push the button at the right time, which didn't always coincide with the time Sarah arrived. That morning, Giselle opened it wearing the face she had when she had slept poorly, or when something was wrong upstairs, which in practice were the same expression. "Running late, huh?" She was already turning her back before finishing the sentence. "Sophia has been crying for half an hour. Get up there." Sarah walked up the marble stairs with her purse on her shoulder, passing through the first-floor hallway where the door to Victoria's master suite was cracked just enough for her voice to slip out. It was a telephone voice, that particular tone of a conversation that doesn't want to be overheard, but hasn't taken the care to close the door. "I can't take this crying anymore. It sounds like a siren. Hire another nanny for God's sake." Sarah kept walking up without slowing her pace. She had learned, over years in other people's houses, that hearing what isn't meant for you is one of the conditions of the job, and that the way to survive it is to distinguish what needs to be kept from what simply needs to be let go. Victoria's voice complaining about nannies was the latter kind. She said it every week. It was Victoria's way of complaining about her daughter without complaining about her daughter. Sophia's room was at the end of the hall. She heard it before opening the door. That child's cry that isn't a tantrum but real despair. The distinction that anyone who works with children learns to make in the first month and never confuses again. She opened the door carefully. Sophia was in the middle of the rug with her toys around her like an island surrounded by things that weren't what she wanted. The French porcelain doll was toppled on its side. The giant plush horse seemed to observe the scene with that impassivity of objects that cannot help. Sarah didn't say anything. She put her purse on a chair, went to Sophia, and knelt on the rug at the girl's eye level. She placed her open hand on Sophia's chest with that gesture she had learned from her grandmother, her entire palm over the child's heart, feeling the accelerated rhythm beneath her fingers. And she began to sing softly. Sophia looked at her, first with that expression of someone who is in the middle of a cry and has been interrupted by something unexpected, then with an attention that grew as the melody continued, the hiccups spacing out, her breathing finding a rhythm that aligned with the song. The connection between them wasn't new. There was something between Sarah and Sophia that had formed since day one. That affinity that happens when a child recognizes in someone a quality of presence that their other adults lack. The quality of someone who is completely there, without their phone on their mind, without the next meeting in their head, without the impatience of someone who has somewhere else to be. Sarah didn't have anywhere else to be. When she was with Sophia, she was with Sophia. It was later, after the girl had fallen into a short morning nap and Sarah had taken the opportunity to tidy the room, that she found the box. It was at the back of the closet, behind a stack of blankets that smelled of lavender, a dark wooden music box with carvings on the sides that showed the work of someone who had made it with care. She pulled it out with her nearest hand, not thinking much of it, assuming it was one of the room's many objects that needed a better place. She opened the lid. The melody began. She stood frozen. It wasn't like the song, it was the song. The exact same progression of notes, the same interval between them. That sequence she had sung thousands of times without ever hearing it from any source other than her grandmother's throat or her own. She stared at the box in her hands with the expression of someone processing something that rational thought hasn't yet grasped, but the body has already recognized. Pinned to the inside lid with tape yellowed by time was a photo. A black woman, young in the picture but with a quality of presence that doesn't depend on age, holding a baby with that care of the first few days. The woman was smiling at someone out of frame, and around her neck was a necklace. Sarah looked down at her own neck, looked back up at the photo, looked down again. The beads were the same colors, in the exact same order. The door opened. Giselle walked in with that efficiency of someone who moves through the house as if it were her own, and doesn't realize that this is a form of occupation. Put that down. She snatched the box from Sarah's hands with a speed that left no room for resistance. It belongs to the girl's late grandmother. It's not a toy. She snapped the lid shut, the mechanism cutting the melody mid-note, and put the box back in the depths of the closet with the blankets, as if the matter were closed. Sarah was left standing with empty hands in the middle of the room. That evening during dinner, she tried. She had prepared what she was going to say the way you prepare a question when English isn't the first language of your heart, weighing every word, choosing the simplest ones, the ones that carry the least possibility of misunderstanding. She had written it on a piece of paper before coming downstairs, because paper was safer than speaking in moments like this. Clearer, harder to interrupt halfway through. Richard was on the phone, elbow on the table, eyes on his plate, but his attention completely elsewhere. Sophia was eating by herself on the other side of the table with that intense concentration of a child who has decided that spaghetti is the main event of the evening. Sarah approached, set down his plate, and then placed the folded paper next to his water glass with the care of someone who knows they are crossing a line, but has no other way to get from this side to the other. Richard glanced at the paper. Read it. Excuse me, sir. That music box. Your mother. Where was she from? He stared at the paper for a second Sarah used to try and read anything on his face. But Richard's face was the kind that had learned not to reveal what was happening inside, trained by years of negotiation and being observed in environments where revealing meant losing. He crumpled the paper. That is none of your business. He turned his gaze back to his phone. Take care of the food and the child. Period. It's hard to hear this and not feel what you feel. A woman who cares for this man's daughter as if she were her own, who calmed the child when he didn't know how, who carries in her chest a mystery that could change the history of that entire family, and receives in return a crumpled piece of paper and 2 sentences. If you also feel outraged by this injustice, leave a like right now. Show that you are on Sarah's side, because her story has barely begun. She cleared the plates at her usual pace, but the melody kept playing inside her, in that place where things stay when they have nowhere to go but don't leave either, waiting for the moment when someone was finally ready to hear what they have to say. The ballroom had been decorated with the kind of care that costs time and money, and results in a cold beauty. That beauty that impresses but doesn't warm you. Victoria had hired a decorating firm that worked for 2 days to achieve that result. Balloons in a gold and white gradient, floral arrangements that matched the palette, a dessert table that looked like it was set up to be photographed rather than eaten. It was the kind of party that exists as much for the parents to show they can throw this kind of party as it does for the child. Victoria's friends had arrived in the early afternoon with that strategic punctuality of people who show up early enough to see the details before the house gets crowded. Sarah circulated with a tray of drinks, using the trained step of someone who knows how to be in a space without being part of it, offering glasses, collecting empty ones, anticipating what needed to be restocked without needing to be called. She had spent years developing this mode, that presence that isn't invisibility, but that occupies the exact space of someone who is available without imposing. She was about 20 feet away when the words reached her. Not all of them, not the whole conversation, but enough. Enough because Victoria hadn't lowered her voice as much as she thought. Or maybe she didn't care if anyone heard, which is sometimes the exact same thing. That new nanny is weird. She keeps singing these strange songs to Sophia. It sounds like voodoo. Her friends laughed with that laugh that exists to confirm the group is aligned, not because the joke is funny, but because laughing together is a way to belong. You have to be careful, you know. One of the friends leaned in slightly as if what she was about to say was a confidence. Those people are superstitious. They cast spells. More laughter. Sarah stood with a tray in her hand, her feet rooted to the varnished hardwood floor, looking at the group from a distance that was exactly the distance of someone who heard and wasn't supposed to hear. She kept her face in that same state of someone doing the work that needs to be done, that composure that isn't indifference, but is the armor you build when indifference isn't a real option. She walked to the kitchen to restock the tray. On the way, she ran her hand over her necklace. Sophia's birthday arrived 2 weeks later with that acceleration that planned events have, where the time between the set date and the actual date always seems shorter than the calendar promised. The house was full of a specific kind of people, those who show up at rich kids' parties and whose presence has more to do with the parents' social network than any affection for the birthday girl. There were children too, of course, but they were outnumbered by adults with wine glasses and conversations that crossed over the children's heads, as if the children's airspace didn't exist. Sophia had been happy all afternoon with that 4-year-old happiness that doesn't need much to be absolute. She ran around, received presents she barely managed to open before wanting the next one, and several times searched the room for the figure in the light blue uniform who was always exactly as far away as she needed to be. When exhaustion hit, it was Sarah who took her to her room, who tucked her in, who stayed by her side until her eyes closed for good. When Sarah went downstairs to help in the kitchen, the party was at the peak of that specific noise, made by adults who have had enough alcohol to be relaxed but not enough to be quiet. Richard was in the center of the room with a glass in his hand, operating in that mode alcohol produces in men who normally control everything. The mode of someone who has dropped their filters without realizing the filters were serving an important function. He saw her walk in. "Hey!" His voice cut over the noise of the room with a projection that made a few heads turn. "Look, it's Sarah! Come on, show everyone that weird song you're always singing. It sounds like a voodoo chant." The noise in the room lost a layer. The kind of silence that comes when people realize something is happening that might be more interesting than the conversation they were having. Sarah stood still with the tray in her hand. Heat crept up her neck with that uncontrollable progression, that flush that appears on the skin before the decision to show it or hide it can be made. She lowered her head slightly. "Richard, stop it." Victoria's voice was that of someone correcting him not out of solidarity, but out of social embarrassment. "You're drunk. I'm joking." He opened his arms as if appealing to the collective common sense of the room. "She's great. Sophia loves her. Right, Sarah?" And then he made the gestures, those gestures that must have seemed funny inside his head in that moment. The kind of imitation people do of cultures they don't understand. His arms moving in ways that didn't correspond to any real dance from anywhere. Just the idea he had formed of something he had never bothered to learn about. Do a little dance. There were laughs. Not from everyone, but enough for the sound to exist. Sarah walked away. Not quickly. Not with the drama of someone who wants their exit noticed. With her usual quiet step, crossing the room toward the hallway, still holding the tray because dropping it would be making a statement, and she wasn't in a position to make statements that night in that house. She reached the hallway, passed through the kitchen, and went up the stairs. On the second step she heard, or maybe just felt, Sophia. The noise of the party had reached upstairs through the path sounds find in large houses, filtering through the hallways, and Sophia had woken up with that disorientation of a child who went to sleep in a dark room and hears the waking world from far away. Sarah went in, walked to the bed, sat on the edge. Sophia's eyes were wide in the darkness with that expression that is half cry and half question. Sarah began to sing. It didn't take much. The melody found Sophia before the full cry arrived, and in 2 or 3 minutes the girl's breathing had returned to the rhythm of sleep, her little arms relaxing at her sides. But then Sophia opened her eyes again. "Why did they laugh at you, Auntie?" The question came with that specific clarity of children's questions that have no intention of hurting, but land exactly where it hurts because they know no detours. Sarah was silent for a moment. "Because sometimes people laugh at what they don't understand, Princess," she said softly. Sophia processed this with that 4-year-old seriousness that is, sometimes, the most honest seriousness there is. Then she reached out her small hand and touched the necklace, running her finger over the beads with the delicate attention of someone examining something precious. "It's so pretty. Was it your mommy's?" Sarah looked at Sophia's fingers on the necklace. "My grandma's," she said after a moment, "who I never really got to know." There was more in that sentence than Sophia could understand. There was a whole history that Sarah carried in pieces, fragments her grandmother had told her before she died, things that hadn't made sense in childhood, and had slowly and incompletely started making sense over the years, like a puzzle coming together but always missing a central piece. Sophia hugged the necklace without letting go of Sarah's neck, and stayed like that until she fell asleep again. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the girl's breathing became deep and regular, with Sophia's hand still resting on the necklace, listening to the distant noise of the party downstairs. Victoria had noticed it even before the party. There was the way Sophia searched for Sarah with her eyes when she entered a room. The way she stopped crying just at the sound of her footsteps in the hall. The way she asked, with that 4-year-old insistence that knows no tact, for Auntie Sarah to give her a bath, Auntie Sarah to read the story, Auntie Sarah, Auntie Sarah. Victoria had tried at first to view it as a practical result. After all, that was what you paid a nanny for. But there was a point where the practical turned into something else, where the child's preference stopped being logistical and became a mirror, and the mirror showed something Victoria didn't want to see. The doll vanished on a Thursday morning. It was Sophia's favorite French porcelain, with a blue dress and painted hair that Sophia said looked just like hers, which was one of the most beautiful things Sarah had ever heard the girl say. Sophia searched every corner of the room with the desperation of a child who still believes things just disappear sometimes, and that looking hard enough solves it. She didn't find it. Giselle appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone carrying out an instruction they'd rather not. "Sarah." Her voice had that public announcement quality, too loud for the size of the hallway. "I need to check your bag." The other 2 staff members who were in the hallway at that moment stopped. Not because anyone asked them to, but because that's what people do when something embarrassing starts to happen. They freeze in a kind of collective paralysis that is equal parts curiosity and discomfort. Giselle searched Sarah's bag with the meticulousness of someone who was instructed to find something and is trying to carry out the instruction despite knowing it's wrong. Every compartment, every fold, every object removed and put back. There was no doll. Giselle closed the bag and handed it back without saying a word, which was, in that context, worse than any word, because it was the absence of an apology where there was plenty of room for one. Victoria appeared in the hallway afterward, wearing the expression of someone who had calculated every part of that moment, but was pretending to have just walked by. "This time was just a warning," she said, looking at Sarah with that smile that wasn't a smile. "If it happens again, you're out." Sarah didn't answer. She took her bag, went to Sophia's room, and found the girl sitting on the rug staring at the empty space where the doll used to sit. She sat on the floor next to her, and the 2 of them stayed like that for a while, side by side, without either needing to put into words what they were feeling, because between them existed that language older than words, the language of those who have been hurt and recognize in the person next to them the exact same kind of wound. The following days were heavy, with that specific quality of weight that accumulates when there's no way to put it down. Sophia had picked up on the tension in the house with the sensitivity of a child who hasn't yet learned to build layers between what she feels and what she shows. She cried more often, woke up during the night, refused her lunch on several occasions with that stubbornness that is always a symptom of something bigger than the food. From the office, when the crying drifted upstairs, came Richard's voice with the impatience of a man trying to work and seeing his work interrupted by something that should be handled by someone else. "For God's sake, make that child stop crying," Sarah sang. It always worked. It was the only thing that worked consistently, and she knew it, and Richard knew it, and Victoria knew it, which made everything more complicated in ways no one in the house was willing to name just yet. But there was something Sarah had noticed that transcended the domestic tension. Something she had started observing with the specific attention of someone who had spent years caring for children, and had learned the difference between the cry of someone who is sad and the cry of someone who is sick. Sophia was pale. Not the paleness of spending an afternoon indoors. A deeper paleness, one that stayed after her bath, that didn't vanish in the garden sun, that had arrived too slowly to be noticed from one day to the next, but that Sarah had noticed because Sarah paid attention to Sophia in a way the other people in that house didn't have the time or the inclination to do. The dark circles under her eyes had arrived at the same time. Sarah watched the sleeping girl after singing her to sleep that night, her hand still on Sophia's chest, feeling her breathing rise and fall, and felt that specific tightness of knowing something is wrong, but not yet having a name for what is wrong. She needed someone in that house to look at Sophia the way she was looking at her. The problem was that looking that way required stopping. And in that house, nobody ever stopped. The appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, a time when Richard would be in a meeting and Victoria would be at the gym, which meant authorization had been granted via a text message with the brevity of someone signing a document without reading it, because they lacked the time or the interest, which is sometimes the exact same thing. Sarah led Sophia by the hand to the car Giselle had called, helped the girl in with the care of someone lifting something fragile, and spent the entire ride looking at Sophia's profile against the window. Her attention had become, over the last few days, more vigilant than caring, the focus of someone monitoring something that worries them. Dr. Charles's office was the kind that projects competence before a single word is spoken. Not luxurious, not performative, but organized with the precision of someone who practices medicine as if it matters. He was a 60-year-old man with glasses and the specific sobriety of someone who has spent decades learning to deliver bad news, with enough care that people can keep breathing after they hear it. He examined Sophia for a time that felt longer than standard checkups usually are. When he called Sarah out into the hallway, Sophia stayed with the nurse, playing with a picture book. Dr. Charles spoke in that hushed hallway voice, the voice of someone being precise without being unnecessarily terrifying. Sophia needs urgent tests. He paused briefly. I'm hearing something in her heartbeat that concerns me. It could be an innocent murmur, which is common and treatable, but it could be something more serious. I need an echocardiogram before I can say for sure. Sarah looked at him with the expression of someone who just had their fears confirmed, while simultaneously hoping they were wrong. She returned to work that afternoon with the doctor's referral folded in her purse and the quiet urgency of someone who knows they need to act, but is still calculating how. Richard was in a meeting. She waited outside his upstairs office with the patience of someone who has learned that certain closed doors must be waited out, not forced. But the meeting dragged on, and when Richard's assistant stepped out and she tried to go in, he looked at her with the expression of someone following instructions and said the boss was busy and that any issues should be left with Giselle. She went to speak to Victoria. Victoria was in the living room with her tablet and a glass of juice, adopting the posture of someone who exists in their home the way certain people do, with the relaxation of someone who never needs to justify their presence anywhere. Sarah held out the doctor's paper. Victoria read it, her eyes gliding over the text with the speed of someone deciding whether they are going to care before they finish reading. So dramatic. She set the tablet aside with the gesture of someone closing a subject. Sophia is perfectly healthy. You're seeing problems where there are none. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was half impatience, half something more deliberate. Get out of here. Sarah put the paper back in her purse. Over the next few days, she began to record. Her phone was old, the screen had a diagonal crack across the top left corner, and the camera struggled in low light, but it was what she had. She recorded the moments when Sophia cried with an intensity that lasted longer than it should. The moments when the girl was left panting after an effort far too small to trigger such a reaction. The moments when her breathing took on a rhythm that Sarah had learned in recent weeks to recognize as wrong. She had 6 videos when she ran into Richard in the elevator. He was on his way out, suit jacket draped over his arm, phone already in hand, holding the posture of someone in permanent transit between one obligation and the next. She stepped into the elevator before the doors closed and opened the gallery, her hands steadier than she expected them to be. He looked at the screen with the superficial attention of someone evaluating how much time this was going to take. Kids cry. It's normal. The doctor said that... Doctor? The shift in his tone was rapid, that speed with which irritation finds a foothold and mutates into something else. What doctor? You took my daughter to the doctor without consulting me? The elevator reached the ground floor. You're fired! The doors opened. Sarah stood in the elevator for a second after Richard stepped out, still holding the phone, The video paused on Sophia's face, cheeks flushed red and eyes far too exhausted for a 4-year-old. Then she walked out. Giselle brought her bag with the belongings she had kept in the staff room, moving with the efficiency of someone executing orders, without allowing themselves to consider the weight of them. The security guards walked one on either side of her to the gate, not because Sarah was any kind of threat, but because there was a protocol, and the protocol required an escort. The gate closed. The rain had started without her noticing, the kind of rain that sneaks up while your attention is elsewhere. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag on her shoulder, the rain running down her hair and her shoulders, staring at the closed gate with the expression of someone taking inventory of what had just happened. Then she heard it. Or rather, she saw it. Because she had glanced up at the mansion's facade out of reflex, and the window to Sophia's room was open, and Sophia was there, both hands on the windowsill, her little face turned downward into the rain. "Auntie Sarah! Auntie Sarah!" The girl's voice cut through the rain with the clarity that children's voices possess when they are calling out to someone with everything they have. Victoria's hand appeared from behind and pulled the window shut. Through the glass, Sarah could see Sophia still calling out, her mouth opening and closing, her arms reaching for what the glass wouldn't allow. And then the crying started. That cry Sarah knew better than any other sound in the world, and that she was now on the outside of, unable to answer. She turned her back and started walking. The days that followed had the texture of days where you have to start over without having chosen to. She returned to her apartment, reorganized what could be reorganized, and found ways to sustain the bare minimum while looking for another job, which didn't arrive with the speed the situation demanded. She started selling homemade sweets on the street in her neighborhood, working from a makeshift stand. They were the same sweets her grandmother had taught her to make, recipes from a place she only knew in fragments, but that had stayed in her hands anyway. Her neighbors bought them out of habit and sympathy, and occasionally a new person would stop, taste them, and come back. With that, she managed to cover the basics, living on the narrow margin of someone who knows that narrow isn't the same as impossible. It was on a Wednesday morning that she recognized the car. Not the specific car, but the type of car. And then she recognized Giselle stepping out with the posture of someone ordered to do something she'd rather avoid, compensating for her discomfort with more rigidity than necessary. Giselle looked at the sweet stand, at the makeshift umbrella Sarah had built out of 2 broomsticks and a piece of tarp, at the fact that Sarah had traded the light blue uniform for a regular blouse but still wore the same beaded necklace. She stood 6 feet away with the hesitation of someone who hadn't rehearsed the opening line of the conversation. "Mr. Richard sent for you," she finally said, using the voice she reserved for delivering messages from someone above her when she didn't want to feel like a messenger. "Sophia won't stop crying. They've gone through 3 nannies. None of them can handle her. You need to come back." Sarah finished wrapping the sweet she was holding before looking at her. "I need to?" she said. "Or can I choose to?" Giselle opened her mouth, then closed it. There was something in that question she hadn't anticipated, something that came from a firmer place than Sarah's apparent situation justified, and it slightly scrambled the script she had practiced in the car. "You'll be well paid," she said. Sarah folded the final edge of the wrapper, placed the sweet on the tray, and looked at Giselle with a calm that wasn't coldness, but rather something forged from years of difficult material. "I don't want money," she said. "I want Sophia to be examined by a real doctor, a cardiologist, and to get the tests Dr. Charles ordered." She paused. "That is the condition. There is no other." Giselle stared at her for a moment. Then she pulled her phone from her pocket and began typing a message, presumably to Richard. With the speed of someone transmitting information they don't want to interpret, just pass along as faithfully as possible. Sarah returned to her stand. An elderly couple had been waiting for the box of truffles they'd ordered 10 minutes earlier. She helped them with her usual care, wrapping the box, taking the money, thanking them, all while Giselle's phone buzzed with Richard's reply, and the morning sun warmed the makeshift tarp above her head. It's hard to hear all this without feeling the weight of what a woman carries when she cares for other people's children better than their own parents do. When she is the only person in an entire house who stops to actually look, and is fired exactly for doing so. If you are on Sarah's side, if you feel the injustice of this in your chest, leave your like right now. Because she is standing on a sidewalk with a sweet stand and a beaded necklace, and yet she is the most dignified person in this story. Giselle's phone buzzed again. She read the message, looked at Sarah. "He accepts," she said. her voice having lost some of its previous rigidity. "The doctor, the tests, everything." Sarah nodded once. She carefully folded the apron from the stand, put her change in her purse, and began taking down the makeshift structure with the movements of someone who already knows she's going back, but not just on any terms. She was going back with a condition met, and with the clarity of someone who had learned, during those days on the sidewalk in the rain, staring at a closed window, that someone else's need for you isn't the same as their power over you, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "I can choose." Sarah returned the next morning, not wearing the light blue uniform, because the uniform had been left behind along with the job, and she hadn't asked for it back. Not out of pride, but because she understood that certain clothes signify a relationship that needed to be renegotiated before it was resumed. She returned in her usual blouse, the necklace around her neck, carrying the same purse she had walked out the gate with days prior. And this time, the gate opened before she even had to wait. Giselle greeted her without her usual expression. There was something different about her. Not exactly warmth, but the softening of someone who had realized over the past few days that she had been on the wrong side of something without consciously choosing to be. Richard was waiting in the living room with the posture of someone who hadn't slept well in days and had stopped trying to hide it. He stood up when she walked in, which was information in itself, because Richard was not the type of man who stood up to greet nannies. "The tests," he said. Just that. As if those two words were the acknowledgement of a debt he still didn't entirely know how to name. "The tests," she confirmed. They took Sophia to the cardiologist on a Wednesday morning with the organized urgency of people who have finally stopped postponing what needs to be done. The doctor was a middle-aged man who possessed the kind of competence that requires no introduction. He examined Sophia with prolonged attention and then called Richard into a separate room, while Sarah stayed with the girl, reading a picture book about a lion who was afraid of his own roar. She watched Richard enter the room and saw, through the glass, the moment the doctor began to speak. She saw the moment Richard sat down. She kept reading the book to Sophia, but her attention was on that glass, on the man who had fired her for taking his daughter to the doctor and who was now hearing what the doctor had to say. When he walked out, his face had changed in a way that wasn't just an expression. It was structural, as if something beneath the surface had slightly given way. Severe heart murmur. Urgent surgery required. He stood in the hallway with the specific immobility of someone who has received information they hadn't prepared for because they refused to prepare, and the cost of not preparing was now higher than it would have been to just listen in the first place. Sarah stepped out of the room holding Sophia's hand and stopped next to him in the hallway. He looked at the little girl. Then he looked at Sarah with an expression she had rarely seen in people like him. The expression of someone who wants to say something but can't find the right shape for the words. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Victoria. He read it, and something in his face closed off in a different way than before. He held the screen out to no one in particular, like someone who needs a witness to confirm that he just read what he read. "Deal with it. I'm busy." Sarah didn't say anything. There are things that need no commentary to be completely understood. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, at the hospital where the cardiologist operated, with the swiftness urgent cases receive when resources are available, and the will to act has finally arrived. On the morning of the surgery, the hospital hallway possessed that specific quality of early morning hospital corridors. Lights too bright for the hour, a clean and impersonal smell, the sound of carts and footsteps that don't rush, because a hospital's rhythm is dictated by necessity, not haste. Sophia was on the gurney wearing a green gown that was far too big for her body, her hair loose, her eyes unsure of how to feel about all this. She had been brave all week with that fragile, genuine courage of children, the kind that holds up right until the doors of the operating room come into view. Sarah was standing next to the gurney. Sophia looked at the doors, then looked at Sarah with an expression that made words irrelevant. "Sing, Auntie." Sarah took her hand, and she began to sing. The melody drifted down the hallway, taking on that acoustic quality hospital corridors unexpectedly amplify, as if the tiles hold the echo of important things and know when to return them. The nurses pushing the gurney kept pushing, but slower. A passing doctor paused for a second before continuing on her way. The operating room doors swung open. The gurney rolled through. Sarah remained outside, the song still on her lips until the doors shut completely, and then she stood in silence, The hand that had been holding Sophia's now resting empty at her side. Richard was watching a monitor in the waiting area. He had seen the entire scene. The hallway camera showing the gurney, the woman beside it, the song he couldn't hear through the screen but could see in the way Sophia had closed her eyes and relaxed her shoulders the moment it began. A waterline formed in his eyes, and he made no effort to hold it back. The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours that Richard and Sarah spent in the waiting room with a few empty chairs between them, each lost in their own silence, each with their own way of waiting. Richard stood for part of the time, sat for the rest, his phone in his hand but his eyes looking past it. Sarah sat with her purse on her lap and her necklace between her fingers, sliding the beads one by one with the movement that had become, over the years, the way her body organized what her mind could not. When the doctor emerged wearing the face doctors wear when the news is good, Richard closed his eyes for a full second before he could process what he was hearing. Successful. Sophia is fine. She will wake up in a few hours. They went to the room where the girl would be brought, and waited there while the bed was prepped, the monitors installed, and all the post-op bureaucracy swirled around them. Sophia arrived still sedated, impossibly small in the hospital bed, a bandage on her chest, her regular breathing confirmed by the monitors in a mechanical, comforting cadence. It was only when everything settled down that Richard looked at Sarah. He had pulled his chair close to the bed, but before sitting down he stared at her with the expression of someone gathering courage for a conversation he knew he needed to have a long time ago. "That song," he said, his voice low in the hospital room. "Where does it come from? My mother used to sing it exactly like that. The same words, the same language." He paused. "She died when I was 22 and never explained it to me. I tried looking for it, but I never found anyone else who knew that melody." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up to her neck and undid the clasp of her necklace with a gesture she had made very few times in her life, because the necklace only came off for sleeping and showering, and even then it stayed within arm's reach. She placed it in the palm of her open hand and held it out to Richard. He looked at the beads, at the colors, at the order they were strung in. She saw the recognition hit his face before he said a word. The same recognition she had felt seeing the necklace in the photo inside the music box. That body memory that bypasses thought. "My grandmother gave it to me," she said. "She worked for a wealthy family for many years, 40 years give or take. In exchange for her work, the family raised my mother alongside their own daughter, as if they were from the same house. She weighed every word with the care of someone building a bridge over something that might not have a far side. But one day they fired my grandmother, and they separated the two girls. My mother went one way, the other girl went another." Richard held the necklace in his hands far too still for a man who normally talked with them constantly. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, like someone testing the weight of every syllable to see if it holds, "worked for my grandfather? Your grandfather had a big house upstate." She looked at the sleeping Sophia for a moment before continuing. "My grandmother used to say the boss's daughter was a little girl with light eyes who loved sitting in her lap. That she learned the song before she even learned to talk properly." A pause. "That girl grew up. Many years later, your grandfather fired my grandmother because she had discovered something he didn't want getting out." Richard had gone pale. That specific paleness that isn't a lack of blood, but blood rushing somewhere else entirely. "What didn't he want getting out?" he asked, though the way he asked made it clear a part of him was already starting to understand. "That the boss's daughter wasn't just the boss's wife's daughter." Sarah spoke with the gentleness of someone handing over something painful, but necessary. "She was the grandfather's daughter with a woman who worked in the house. A woman who later became like family because she was honest and careful, and loved both girls equally." She took a breath. "My grandmother raised the boss's daughter as if she were her niece, and she raised my mother as her own daughter. The two of them grew up together. They both wore the same necklace because my grandmother made two identical ones." The room was silent, except for the rhythm of the monitors. Richard looked at the necklace, looked at Sarah, and there was something in his eyes that was being reassembled as he watched, like flipping a puzzle over, and seeing the pieces take the shape they always had, but that hadn't been visible from the previous angle. Sarah opened her purse. She took out the photo. It was yellowed, with that tint decades give to photo paper carefully stored, but never completely protected from time. 3 figures. A middle-aged woman with the smile Sarah had learned to associate with the word grandmother, even without truly knowing her. And two little girls, one on each side, their arms wrapped around the woman, identical necklaces around their necks, visible even in the faded picture. Richard took the photo with both hands. He stared at the girl on the left for a time long enough that the silence gained its own texture. "My mother," he said. Not as a question, as an identification. Sarah nodded. "So you and I," he started. "We don't share blood," she said before he could finish, with the clarity of someone who had traveled the exact same mental path and arrived at the same destination. "Your mother and my mother were raised as sisters, by the same woman, the same song, the same necklace. But not the same blood." Richard stood holding the photo, the necklace beside him, looking like a man taking inventory of something he had lost without ever knowing he possessed it. "But the same soul," he said, repeating the words she had used earlier without realizing he was repeating them. "The same song. The same pain of being separated," she finished. He didn't answer right away. He stared at Sophia sleeping in the bed with the bandage on her chest and her regular breathing, the little girl who had stopped crying for the first time in weeks when she heard a melody that had crossed generations, separations, and 40 years of silence to reach her through the throat of a woman he had fired for caring too much. When he turned back to Sarah, tears were falling down his face and he was doing nothing to stop them, the kind of crying that comes when the armor finally shatters all at once, and there's no structure left to hold back what it was meant to contain. He stood up from his chair, and he hugged Sarah with the strength of someone holding on to, not just a person, but a connection that had almost been lost forever, burying his face in her shoulder like someone who has arrived at a destination after a very long time and only realizes how homesick they were once they finally get there. "You're not a nanny," he said, his voice muffled by the embrace, a sentence that emerged as both an acknowledgement and a confession. "Your family. The only family that actually took care of my daughter." Sarah stood perfectly still for a second, her arms at her sides, that brief second that happens when someone receives what they've waited a very long time to receive, needing a moment to confirm it's real. Then she lifted her arms and hugged him back. In the bed, Sophia slept to the steady new rhythm of a repaired heart. The monitor marked every beat with a regularity that is, in the language of machines, the exact same rhythm as a lullaby. The song that had crossed generations had, at last, arrived where it needed to be. Sophia left the hospital on a sunny day with that quality of light that feels personally chosen for certain moments, that brightness that hits you after days inside a closed building and makes the outside world look more real than usual. She was lighter, in a way that wasn't just physical. It was in the way she held Sarah's hand as they walked through the parking lot, not with the tight grip of a scared child, but with the casual touch of someone simply happy to be beside the person they want to be with. The bandage was still hidden under her shirt, but the paleness had begun to fade, replaced by a color in her cheeks that Sarah only noticed once it started returning, because that's how certain things work. You only realize how much they were missing when they begin to reappear. Richard opened the car door, helped Sophia inside, and paused before closing it, his hand on the handle and his eyes on Sarah, in a way that was different from any way he had ever looked at her before. "You're riding in the front car," he said. It wasn't an instruction from an employer to an employee. It was something else, spoken in a different voice, and Sarah recognized the shift because she had spent years learning to distinguish the different ways people say the exact same words. She got into the front car. The mansion appeared at the end of the tree-lined street just as it always had, but there was something different about arriving there now, after everything that had happened in the interim. It felt like returning to a place you know by heart, only to realize your memory is slightly misaligned with reality, that the dimensions aren't exactly what you remembered. Sophia ran through the gate, dashing up the stone path toward the front door, with the bursting energy of a child who has just been released from the hospital and needs to physically confirm to her own body that she is back in the world. Richard stopped in the foyer. Giselle was standing there with her usual posture, but something in her shoulders had shifted over the last few weeks, a rigidity that had yielded at some internal point she hadn't quite fully acknowledged yet. "Giselle," Richard said, his tone carrying the weight of something rehearsed that sounds different out loud than it did in his head. "Sarah is no longer an employee in this house." Giselle froze. "She is my guest, my family." He paused. "I want the room next to Sophia's prepared for her, not the staff quarters." the guest room overlooking the garden. The ensuing silence possessed that specific quality that arises when a single piece of information reorganizes the structure of an entire environment, and the people within it are still processing what has just changed. It was then that the front door opened again. Victoria walked in dragging a rolling suitcase, sporting the tan of someone who had spent a week in Miami without checking her messages with the frequency the situation demanded. She carried that post-vacation energy, oblivious to what she was about to walk into. She saw Sarah in the foyer, saw Richard standing next to her, processed the room assignment that had just been mentioned. "What?" The word slipped out, not as a question, but as a refusal to accept what her eyes were presenting as a real possibility. Richard looked at her for a moment. "Welcome back," he said, with a serenity that was, in that context, more disorienting than any direct confrontation. "We have a lot to talk about." The dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday. Richard had invited the exact same people who had attended Sophia's birthday party, the same faces that had laughed that night, that had listened to the impersonations and the comments about voodoo and spells without saying a word. The same people who had witnessed the treatment of a woman who was, in this moment, sitting at the table as the guest of honor. The table was set with its usual meticulous care, but Sarah's place was to Richard's immediate right, the seat that, at any dinner party, broadcasts a clear message about the relationship between the person sitting there and the person who chose the seating arrangement. The guests arrived with that mixture of curiosity and discomfort, belonging to people who accept a dinner invitation only to realize upon arriving that the evening is entirely different from what they expected. The initial conversations were far more cautious than usual, eyes darting towards Sarah and quickly looking away, like people assessing something they don't quite know how to categorize. Victoria sat at the opposite end of the table, wearing the expression of someone carefully surveying the terrain before making a move. Richard stood up, glass in hand, just as the main courses were being served. That specific moment when the table's attention is still fully available, yet enough food and wine have circulated to make everyone receptive. "I want to introduce you to Sarah." The table fell silent with the abrupt stillness of someone interrupted mid-sentence. "Some of you already know her. She was in this house as my daughter's nanny. She was in this very room serving drinks at a party." He took a pause that wasn't for dramatic effect, but to ensure what followed received the space it deserved. "And that same night some of you laughed at her. You mocked her culture. You called what you didn't understand weird. Not a single fork moved. What I have since discovered is that the song Sarah sings is the exact same song my mother used to sing to me when I was a child. The same language, the same melody, because Sarah's grandmother raised my mother. She cared for her as her own daughter. She taught her the song that I carried with me without ever knowing where it came from." He looked at Sarah, and in that gaze was something the entire room could see, even without him having to name it. Blood does not unite us, but love does. And that love survived in a song for 40 years, waiting for the exact moment it needed to arrive. The silence carried the weight of a sentence that cannot be answered immediately, because the words require a moment to be fully absorbed. At the far end of the table, Giselle swallowed hard, a visible movement of someone processing something that goes far beyond digestion. Victoria was the first to speak. "This is a scam." Her voice held the firmness of someone gambling on a strong offense before a defense becomes necessary. "She wants money. She shows up with a pretty story, a photo, a necklace, and expects us to buy it." She looked around the table seeking allies. "It's obvious." Sarah didn't answer right away. She turned to Giselle, who was standing on the other side of the room, and spoke in a low voice that carried more weight than any volume ever could. "Giselle, could you please bring the music box from the closet in Sophia's room?" Giselle left and returned in less than 2 minutes carrying the dark wooden box she had snatched from Sarah's hands weeks earlier with the harshness of someone blindly following orders. She placed it on the table in front of Sarah with a gentleness completely unlike before. Sarah opened the lid. The melody began. There were people at that table who had never heard that sequence of notes, and yet fell quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. There was something in the melody that induced that state of focus certain sounds command, the undeniable quality of something ancient. Sarah placed the photo of her grandmother and the 2 little girls next to the box. And next to the photo, her necklace. "Inside the lid," she said, "there is a photograph. The woman is my grandmother. The 2 girls are wearing the same necklace because my grandmother made 2 identical ones, one for each." She looked at Victoria with the serenity forged over a lifetime of having to be calm in moments that did not deserve it. The necklace belonging to the girl on the left is on this table. The necklace belonging to the girl on the right is in old photos of Richard's mother, which he showed me at the hospital. Victoria opened her mouth. That doesn't prove. It proves enough. Richard had remained quiet during Sarah's presentation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different from the one he used to conclude business meetings. It was deeper, more personal. He looked at his wife with the expression of a man who has reached a clearing after a very long time wandering in the fog. And it also proves that while my daughter was in the hospital with a severe heart murmur needing emergency surgery, you were in Miami texting me to deal with it. Victoria's mouth hung open, trapped in the space between a sentence and a rebuttal she couldn't find. Child abandonment carries legal weight, he continued, his voice maintaining its calm register, as does adultery when there is proof. My lawyers have the proof. First thing tomorrow morning, they will file for divorce. She went pale, that specific paleness that isn't complete shock. It's the paleness of someone who always knew there was a risk, but bet against it materializing. You can't. Security will assist you in packing what you need for the next few days, Richard stated, with the finality of a door swinging shut. The rest will be handled by the lawyers. Victoria stared at him for a moment. Then she looked at the table, at the guests who suddenly couldn't find a place to rest their eyes, and finally at Sarah, who was looking back at her. Sarah's expression was worse than anger, because it wasn't anger at all. It was simply the look of someone who had seen everything, understood everything, and required no further expression. She stood up. The security guards were already at the door, as if they knew the moment had arrived, because they probably did. Victoria's exit from the dining room lacked dignity, not because she was being forced out, but because she had already spent her dignity elsewhere, in entirely different ways. Giselle remained standing, her eyes glued to the tablecloth. After dinner, as the guests departed with the hurried pace of people desperate for time to process what they had just witnessed, Giselle approached Sarah. Sarah was in the kitchen, helping to put away the leftovers with the natural rhythm of someone who does the work regardless of the circumstances. Sarah. Giselle's voice had a different texture, stripped of its usual rigidity, lacking its protocol-driven efficiency. I know I can't undo what I did. Searching your bag. Doing it in front of the other staff. She paused, but I want to tell you I regret it truly. Sarah looked at her for a moment. She didn't say, it's okay, because it wasn't. And she had learned that saying it's okay when it isn't is a lie that mostly hurts the person telling it. But there was something in her gaze that wasn't resentment. It was closer to the closing of a chapter than the holding of a grudge. She nodded once, and went back to putting away the leftovers. The months that followed had the quality of time settling after a massive upheaval, when a new life begins to find its own rhythms and habits, ceasing to feel temporary. The room next to Sophia's caught the morning sun through the window overlooking the garden, exactly as Richard had requested. Sarah had placed the dark wooden statuette, the patterned fabric, and the photo of her grandmother with the candles on her shelf. The room took on the warmth of spaces that are truly inhabited, carrying the presence of the person, even when they aren't there. Sophia had recovered with the speed unique to childhood, her body repairing what needed to be repaired with an efficiency doctors described in clinical terms, but which in practice felt like a simple miracle. She ran through the garden with knees stained with dirt, her hair escaping her ponytail, her lungs working without the hidden burden that had been there for so long. Richard had changed. It wasn't a performance of remorse. It was the genuine result of a man who had received enough information to understand what he had been doing, and made the decision, the kind of decision some people manage to make and others never do, to be different. He played with Sophia in the garden with a presence that had been entirely absent before. Not the presence of someone who shows up when it's convenient, but the presence of someone who has made showing up his priority. On a Sunday afternoon, the three of them were in the garden near the swing that had been hung from the large oak by the wall. Sophia was on the swing, her legs pumping back and forth, demanding to go higher with the pure, ancient joy that only a swing can provide. "Auntie, sing it again?" Sarah sang. The melody drifted through the garden with the lightness songs possess when the air is open and there are no walls to contain them, rising slightly before dispersing into the afternoon. And then another voice joined in. It was imperfect. It carried the mistakes of someone learning a language by ear without the benefit of having grown up with it. The vowels slightly skewed, the consonants searching for the right placement in the throat. But it was real. It was Richard. He had asked Sarah to teach him over the previous weeks, and he had learned it with the determination of someone realizing they are studying something they should have known all their lives. The two voices blending in the garden were the song of the past and the song of the present, existing all at once. Sophia looked from one to the other, her 4-year-old face the picture of pure surprise and absolute joy, and then she began humming along to the parts she had memorized without anyone ever asking her to. Because children hold on to what matters long before they understand why it matters. Now I have to ask you, you've heard everything Sarah carried. The humiliation at the party, the doll hidden to frame her, the firing in the pouring rain, the window shut in her face with Sophia trapped on the other side. And in the end, when she had every reason in the world to walk away and never look back, she stayed. Not for the job, not for the money, for the little girl, and for the song that had crossed generations to reach that exact spot. If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have stayed after everything? Or would you have walked away and left those people to solve their own problems? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you think. The final scene took place on a quieter afternoon weeks later, when the garden was bathed in that golden late afternoon light that makes everything look older and more beautiful than it actually is. Richard had brought out a box of old photos that had been shoved into the back of a closet for years. The kind of box that exists in every home, pushed further back with every changing season, because there is always something more urgent to do than look through it. They were sitting on the stone bench near the rose bushes, flipping through the pictures with the slow pace that kind of afternoon demands. Richard paused on a photograph. It was black and white, with the grainy texture unique to old film, showing some kind of party with dozens of people scattered across what looked like a sprawling lawn. In the foreground stood Richard's mother as a teenager, wearing the smile that survived in all the photos he kept. And in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, was a woman serving something to a guest. Sarah recognized the posture before she even fully registered the face. It was the posture of someone who serves without ever making herself small. She reached out and touched the figure in the background. "That's my grandmother," she said. Richard stared at the photo for a long time. At his mother in the foreground, at the woman in the back, at the physical distance between them in the picture, a distance that persisted for decades afterward, and that had, through a story neither of them lived to see the end of, finally found a way to close. "They're together again now," he said. It was a simple sentence, the kind that doesn't try to be more than it is, and perhaps for that exact reason, reaches places that elaborate speeches never could. Sarah looked at the photo for a moment longer. Then she felt Sophia's arms wrap around them both at once. The little girl had sprinted across the garden and thrown herself between the two adults with the sheer exuberance of someone who requires no context to know when a hug is needed. The three of them stayed like that on the stone bench, the golden afternoon light washing over them, surrounded by the song that none of them were actively singing in that moment, but which was present all the same. Present the way certain melodies linger after being heard enough times. In the air, in the walls, in the memory of the space that finally learned how to hold them. This story teaches us that true love wears no uniform, has no fixed address, and requires no shared blood. That the most real families are sometimes the ones who recognize each other by a song before they recognize each other by anything else. And that a person's dignity never diminishes just because the world tries to force them into a role too small to hold them. If you love stories about love that crosses generations, about justice arriving on its own terms, and about families finding each other when the world thought they were separated forever, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to join our family. Because as long as there are stories like this to tell, there is a reason to keep listening.